Welcome to the first lesson. In this lesson, we're going to cover all of the different tools that we need in order to build these plugins. So we'll look at things like code editors, browsers, the Bubble plugin editor, and so on and so forth. And we'll just get a sense of all the things you need on your computer and on your screen in order to be building these plugins. So first, what I'll do is I'll give you a quick overview of the different categories of things we have here in these buckets. And then we'll look at each different tool quickly just to see what they look like. And then you'll see them come back repeatedly through the course. So in orange here, we've got an operating system. You need something on your computer, and that will affect your developer experience, how you install packages, how you get software running. You need a browser in order to run Bubble, of course. You need some kind of editor to edit your code, to write and edit and debug your code. You need some kind of shell or terminal or command line. Now, I'll get into the details of how these things aren't quite all the same thing, but whenever you're interacting with a server, let's say, you'll need to use one of these tools like Bash. Of course, we have Bubble as our platform, and then we have two buckets here for infrastructure. So the red one is development infrastructure. This is what we'll need to spin up if we're just running a server for testing. And then our production infrastructure, which we'll get into at the end of the course, is when you want to scale your servers, your service to more users, then we'll look at things to make that more robust. So let's get into this in a little bit more detail. So for an operating system, I'm using Ubuntu Linux for my operating system. You could be on Windows, you could be on Mac, it doesn't really matter. But when you're installing packages, when you're getting code editors, when you're writing and debugging your code, installing Python, all these different things, the operating system that you're using will impact those kinds of things. So like I said, I use Linux because I think it has the best developer experience. It's easy to install packages, to debug what's going wrong. You can control the whole system. That's one reason I like it. Another reason I like it is when we deploy servers, they're almost always running some distribution of Linux. And the reason I use Ubuntu Linux, which is one flavor of Linux, let's say, is because it's the most common distribution. It's the most widely used. It's very stable. There are lots of other great distributions like Mint and Arch, and it goes on and on and on. I've used all of them, but I currently use Ubuntu because it's sort of minimal fuss, no mess. It just works out of the box most of the time. Setup guides for different packages tend to be include some Ubuntu instructions. So if you're not using Linux and you're interested in exploring it, I would suggest trying Ubuntu. And specifically, I would suggest trying it in the context of a virtual machine, which we might talk about. But basically, you can install sub-operating systems like Ubuntu on your machine. Let's say you're running on a MacBook. You can install Linux sort of part of your hard drive and then just run that within your OS. It's sort of out of scope for this course, but we can talk about it in the discussion section, or if you're interested in doing this. But it doesn't really matter at the end of the day what operating system you're on. I'm just mentioning it because when you see certain tools or Windows, it might be unusual if you haven't seen Linux tutorials before. So that's number one. Number two is we need a browser. So Firefox is my browser of choice, but I use Chrome, Chromium, I use Brave browser. But I like Firefox because the developer tools are really good. So if you need to inspect your network traffic or the JavaScript console, or you need to see where the memory is being used or what have you, and we'll get into that in the course. I like the Firefox experience. I also like their business model. They're focused on privacy and protecting users' rights and things. And so this is my go-to. Again, it doesn't really matter what browser you're using, but just so you're oriented when you're looking at, these the taskbars and things up here, you know what we're looking at. One of the most important sets of tools that we're going to use in this course are code editors. So whenever you write code, you need some way to get that text into the computer, those instructions into the computer. There's basically three levels of three different types of software that you can use. You have text editors, code editors, and then IDEs, or integrated development environments. And these are effectively a spectrum along the line of how much functionality specific for coding those tools have. So as an example of a text editor, something like Notepad on Windows or Notes on iOS, those are text editors. You can enter text into them, and in theory, you could write code in them just fine. You could write your Python or JavaScript in those things, and then when you're ready to use them, you just have to either compile them or run them or whatever, but it doesn't really matter where you write them, as long as you're able to write the text to get the instructions to the computer. The next level up is something called a code editor. And so if you've ever used something like Sublime Text or Atom, these are basically text editors that have functionality for coding on top. So they'll highlight your syntax. If you have special statements, they'll be in different colors. It might tell you when you've made a mistake, things like that. So a code editor is like the next step along the line. And VS Code is probably the most popular, widely used code editor in the world. It kind of straddles the line between code editor and IDE, but for the most part, it's a nice, relatively lightweight-ish editor. There's tons of extensions, lots of plugins that you can just add functionality to it really easily. So it's a great default. If you've never coded before, VS Code is what I'd recommend. There's reasons you might not want to use it. If you're not a big fan of Microsoft's privacy policy, or if you want something that's going to run on lower resource machines, what have you, there are lots of other options, but VS Code's a good starting point unless you have a reason not to use it. And so this is what VS Code looks like. I've got the ChatGPT Bubble plugin repository loaded up here. You can see you have your code over here on the right, and you've got your files on the left, and you can install extensions over here, all sorts of good stuff. And so we'll learn this interface, we'll learn how to use this, we'll learn how to use it with GitHub Copilot to write our code. And this should be a good starting point for learning how to write code if you haven't before, so we'll start here. The other editor that we're going to look at is Cursor. Cursor is a fork of VS Code. So they basically took the VS Code code base and duplicated it and then started to add their own goodness to it. And what Cursor does basically is bring LLM feedback into your code editor. So if you've ever tried to write code, say with ChatGPT, you get some streaming out on the screen and then you copy it and paste it into your editor, and that works. It's fine. We're going to do that in this course. But when you start using Cursor, basically that integration, that code is being generated in your editor, and you can just click apply these changes and it will affect your files. So it tightens that cycle, that development cycle, and it can really, really speed up your development time. So Cursor is an excellent tool that we'll cover in this course. And then over here we have Cursor, and Cursor is, as you can tell, it looks similar to VS Code. We've got this little window over here, which is our chat window. But if we open our file explorer, you can see kind of similar here to VS Code. Now, it doesn't look identical, of course, because they've forked it and they're changing it and they're making it their own. But if you're familiar with the VS Code interface and how to work within it, then transitioning to this will be a breeze. It's very, very similar. And I'll say we're not going to cover any of the heavier, more heavy-duty integrated development environments. So these are tools that have a whole bunch of additional functionality built in for like running and debugging and inspecting your code and tracking variables through the execution, things like that. Those are great and they're pretty popular. Like if you're in a professional software development environment, you'll see a lot of these. But we're not going to do that just because I think it's a bit overkill for the kinds of projects that we're going to be working on in this course. And they're not my favorite way to work. And you'll see why a little bit later. But so we won't go all the way to IDEs. We'll stick to the sort of code and text editor tools. And the last one that we'll use is something called Vim. Now, Vim, people either love it or hate it. It's a text editor that's on most Linux distributions. You can get it on Windows and Mac too. But basically, it's an old school text editor from the 80s, I think. And it's focused on only using the keyboard, not using the mouse. And it's really fast. It's really nice to use once you understand how it works. But there's quite a bit of a learning curve there. But I'll get into why I really like this more as the course goes on. But for this course, the main application we'll see is when we connect to our servers, when we connect to a remote machine like on AWS, and we need to interact with configuration files, or we need to start servers and things like that. We're going to be in the terminal, in the shell, and Vim is a terminal first text editor. So you do all of your editing in a terminal window. And I can show you what that looks like real quick here. So this is a terminal. If I type text.txt, say this is a file, this is what Vim looks like. There's no buttons, there's no menus, there's just text, right? And you can change all of this, of course, but this is basically what we'll be looking at when we're looking at our remote machines. I'll close that. So those are the editors. The next thing is the shell tools. So these are also part of the shell or the command line or the terminal. If we open another terminal, so this program here, this window, is what's called a terminal emulator. So it's called that because it's emulating a terminal when you used to like connect to old mainframes and you had a connection to the computer. But in any case, we usually just call it a terminal. And this program has certain things that it does. But then whenever you run a command in this terminal, that command has to be parsed and interpreted and then do something. So it might be passing it off to another program. It might be doing something on your file system or whatever. But the point is, you need something to interpret this command that you're typing in. So in Linux, the default shell in most terminal emulators is what's called bash, or the born again shell. This is the most common shell that's used. If we spin up a server on AWS or GCP or some other platform, usually bash is the basically the layer between us and the computer that we're talking to. And if this doesn't make any sense yet, it will in a couple of classes. But basically, when we spin up a server, we have bash installed, and that's how we're interacting with the computer. There's another one I'll be using through this course called Zeesh or Z Shell. And this is very similar to bash. It just has some nice shortcuts and key bindings, and we might get into where that becomes helpful. It's not super important to this course, but just so you know, there's lots of different shells. And if you get really into working on the terminal, administering remote machines, that kind of thing, this is somewhere you might want to spend some time because you can get some massive productivity gains from learning how these things work. Okay, so the next section is Bubble. So of course, we're building Bubble plugins. We could have started with this, I suppose, but there's going to be a couple of pieces that we have to be very familiar with. Number one, of course, will be the plugin editor. So we'll go through this in detail soon. But understanding how a plugin is put together, where to put your code, where to change things, and so on and so forth, we'll become very comfortable with that. And then just the Bubble application editor. So as we're building our plugin, we're going to be testing it in one of our Bubble apps and eventually installing it on other apps and so forth. And so we're going to have to look at the connection between things in the Bubble app itself and things in the Bubble plugin and how to make those things talk to each other. So of course, we'll be spending a lot of time in both of those. Now on to development infrastructure. I'll move my screen back here. There are different ways that there's lots of different ways that we can do this. The way that I like to build plugins is I like to have a development server that I can turn on and off. And I run a web server and I take the traffic in and I can inspect it, I can see it. And you use several different technologies in order to be able to do that. It's not the only way that you can do that, but so what I run on the development server that will spin up for the first instance is I run an AWS machine on EC2, which is Elastic Cloud Compute. And this is basically how you launch servers on AWS. You spin up a server on AWS, and it's running Ubuntu, Linux that I mentioned at the beginning. And from there, it doesn't really do anything. So what we do is we open up some ports, which you'll see what those are, to allow traffic to come in. And then you have to figure out what to do with the traffic. So we install a web server called Nginx, is this. And so that will take the request and do something with it. From there, we pass it off to our application server, which is Fast API. And so what this does is it takes our request and does whatever our internal application logic is. So it might be, preparing a request to go off to an LLM like ChatGPT. That's what Fast API does. Now, in order to be able to communicate between a server and a client, or a browser and a server, in a secure way, we need to use something called SSL or HTTPS. This is a way basically of encrypting your traffic between your user's computer and your server, just so that it can't be spied on. And so to do that, we'll be using a tool called Certbot from the Electronic Frontier Foundation, or EFF. And this allows us to generate free SSL certificates. Just if you've never seen SSL or HTTPS, anytime you have a URL in your browser, it should say HTTPS and then : / whatever. But that S on the end means secure. So that's how we keep our data safe in transit. So we'll get into that as well. And then the last thing is Docker. So Docker is a tool for taking your code and packaging it up so you can move it around. And we use it on the development machine because when we get to production, we have to take that Docker image and push it up to the cloud so that it can be spun out to other servers. You don't need to run Docker on your development machine. We'll get into these details later, but keeping your development machine sort of in sync with your production environment makes it a lot easier. And then the last thing that we'll look at sort of at the end of the course is advanced production infrastructure. So if let's say you have 10 or 50 users for a plugin, one server is probably fine. But if you have 1,000 users, a server might go down. If you have 10 or 100,000 users for your app, a single server is often not sufficient. So what we do is we create multiple servers and we balance the traffic across them. This is one thing we do. It's not the only option. You can also do what's called serverless architectures. So we don't have a server. We have what are called serverless functions. and they just sort of spin up as needed. And we'll talk about that model as well. That has different trade-offs, pros and cons. But we'll be getting our hands dirty quite a bit with these different cloud providers, AWS especially. And so the last thing I'll say just in this intro is we're going to look at something called a CloudFormation template, which is basically a text file that defines a whole bunch of different services on the cloud, on AWS, that all fit together. So things like load balancers and container storage and stuff like that. And we'll just look at this to get a sense of what this might be useful for. When your infrastructure gets to a certain level of complexity, it's good to have this, it's called infrastructure as code. So you have this piece of code or piece of text that you keep alongside your code. And as your infrastructure changes and your code changes, those things can stay in sync. But like I said, we'll get to this at the end of the course because it's not strictly necessary for plugin development, but it is important to know how to do this if you want to scale your plugins backend. So that about wraps up this intro. Now, the next thing we're going to do is start to get into actually using some of these tools.